There comes a moment when your soul simply stops bending. Have you noticed how some people seem to possess an invisible shield, an unshakable core that refuses certain violations without explanation or apology? This isn't hardness or cruelty. It's something far more profound. It's the mysterious emergence of what Carl Jung called spiritual maturity, where the psyche develops its own immune system against what no longer serves its evolution. When we embark on what Jung termed the journey of individuation, something unexpected happens. We don't become more tolerant of everything, as many spiritual teachings suggest. Instead, we become selectively intolerant, developing an inner radar that immediately identifies what threatens our authentic self. This paradox puzzled Jung throughout his work. How does spiritual growth simultaneously make us more compassionate, yet less willing to accept certain behaviors? The answer lies in understanding that true maturity isn't about endless accommodation, but about sacred discernment. Today we're exploring 10 specific things that a spiritually mature person, guided by Jungian principles, simply cannot tolerate anymore. These aren't arbitrary preferences or personality quirks. They represent the natural boundaries that emerge when consciousness expands and the authentic self takes its rightful place as the governing force of our inner world. Each point we'll explore reveals how individuation creates what Jung might call psychological antibodies, protecting the integrity of our spiritual development. The first thing a mature soul cannot tolerate is subtle energetic violation. Jung understood that human beings constantly project their unconscious content onto others, and when we haven't done our inner work, these projections become toxic invasions of another's psychic space. Imagine walking into a room and immediately feeling drained, not because of anything spoken, but because of the invisible emotional debris someone has scattered around your energy field. A spiritually mature person develops what we might call energetic discernment. They can sense when someone is attempting to discharge their unprocessed shadow material into their psychic atmosphere. This isn't paranoia or oversensitivity. It's the natural development of what Jung called the transcendent function, where conscious and unconscious contents merge to create wisdom. When this function awakens, you begin to feel physically uncomfortable around people who use emotional neediness as a form of energetic vampirism. You recognize the difference between genuine vulnerability and the calculated performance of helplessness designed to extract energy from others. The compulsive need to rescue every wounded soul that crosses your path begins to dissolve. Instead, a sacred protection emerges. You realize that allowing others to dump their unprocessed psychological material onto your energy field isn't kindness. It's enabling both their unconsciousness and your own spiritual stagnation. This boundary isn't erected from ego, but from a deeper understanding that everyone must face their own shadow to truly heal. There's a particular alchemy that occurs when you stop absorbing others' emotional chaos. Jung observed that the psyche naturally seeks equilibrium, and when we cease functioning as emotional repositories for others' unprocessed material, we create space for what he called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage between conscious intention and unconscious wisdom. Your energy field begins to hum with a different frequency, one that attracts genuine seekers rather than emotional parasites. This shift happens gradually, like watching a garden slowly clear itself of weeds when the soil conditions change. The second thing that becomes unbearable is manipulative emotional theater. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the persona, the mask we wear to navigate social situations. However, when someone uses their persona specifically to control and manipulate others, a mature soul recognizes this immediately. Think of the person who turns every conversation into a performance of their suffering, not seeking genuine connection, but orchestrating an emotional symphony designed to place you in the role of their savior. The difference between authentic pain and manipulative performance becomes crystal clear when you've done your own inner work. Genuine suffering has a quality of rawness, of vulnerability, that asks for nothing beyond witnessing. Manipulative suffering always contains an agenda, always pushes for a specific response, always makes you feel responsible for fixing something that only they can heal. When you encounter someone who uses tears as weapons of control, who orchestrates crisis after crisis to maintain their position at the center of everyone's attention, your body begins to recoil instinctively. This isn't hardness, it's wisdom. You understand that participating in these emotional dramas doesn't help anyone heal. It simply perpetuates cycles of unconsciousness that keep everyone trapped in infantile patterns of relating. Jung recognized that emotional manipulation often stems from what he called the pure eternus complex, the eternal child who refuses to take responsibility for their own psychological development. When you've outgrown this pattern in yourself, witnessing it in others becomes almost unbearable, like watching someone deliberately choose to remain trapped in a cage whose door stands wide open. Your soul recognizes the futility of trying to free someone who has made their prison into their identity. The third intolerable thing is the expectation to sacrifice your authentic self for others' comfort. Jung believed that the greatest tragedy was when a person betrays their own nature to gain approval from others. When you've walked the path of individuation, you cannot unknow what you know about your true essence. The pressure to diminish your light, to make yourself smaller so others feel less threatened by your growth, becomes not just uncomfortable but spiritually impossible. This often manifests in relationships where your expansion is seen as a betrayal of who you used to be. Family members might pressure you to return to old patterns of behavior that once kept the system stable, but now feel like death to your awakened consciousness. Friends might express discomfort with your new boundaries, your unwillingness to participate in gossip, or your desire for deeper conversations than surface-level social chatter. A mature soul recognizes that betraying your authentic nature for external approval is a form of spiritual suicide. The pain of disappointing others becomes less frightening than the agony of disappointing your own soul. You develop what Jung might call an inner marriage between your conscious ideals and your authentic expression, making it impossible to fragment yourself for the comfort of those who haven't done their own inner work. What emerges from this process is something Jung called the birth of the psychological individual, distinct from the collective consciousness that once governed your choices. You begin to notice how certain social gatherings feel like wearing clothes that no longer fit, how conversations that once seemed normal now feel hollow and draining. This isn't superiority. It's simply that your soul has developed more refined tastes, like a musician whose ear has become attuned to subtle harmonies that others cannot yet perceive. The fourth thing that becomes unbearable is systematic devaluation, those subtle attempts to make you feel insignificant or question your worth. Jung understood that when people feel threatened by your growth or authenticity, they often resort to what he termed narcissistic injuries, small cuts designed to diminish your sense of self. These might appear as backhanded compliments, subtle criticisms wrapped in concern, or the constant minimizing of your achievements and insights. A spiritually mature person develops immunity to these tactics, not through defensiveness, but through inner knowing. When you've established a relationship with your authentic self, external attempts to diminish you feel foreign, like wearing clothes that no longer fit. You recognize these behaviors as projections of the other person's insecurity, rather than accurate assessments of your worth. The ability to distinguish between constructive feedback and destructive criticism becomes effortless. Constructive feedback seeks to support your growth and comes from a place of genuine care. Destructive criticism seeks to diminish your spirit, and usually stems from the critic's own unhealed wounds and jealousy of your progress. When you encounter someone who consistently tries to make you feel less than you are, you simply create distance without drama or explanation. There's something Jung called the self-preserving instinct that awakens during individuation, an inner guardian that recognizes threats to your psychological well-being before your conscious mind fully processes them.
This instinct operates like a sophisticated early warning system, creating visceral discomfort when you encounter people whose primary mode of relating involves diminishing others to elevate themselves. Your body wisdom becomes your guide, steering you away from those who cannot celebrate your light without trying to dim it. The fifth unbearable thing is the invasion of your sacred boundaries.
Jung spoke of psychological space as real and measurable as physical space, requiring protection and respect. A mature soul understands that boundaries aren't walls built from fear, but sacred containers that preserve the integrity of your inner development. When someone consistently pushes against these boundaries, demanding explanations for your limits or trying to guilt you into abandoning your standards, your entire being rebels. This might manifest as someone who refuses to accept no as a complete sentence, who probes for justifications they can then argue against. They might use phrases like, "But family comes first," or, "If you really cared about me, you would," to manipulate you into abandoning your healthy limits. A spiritually mature person recognizes these tactics as attempts to return them to earlier stages of development, where external approval was more important than internal integrity.
The freedom to maintain your boundaries without elaborate explanations emerges naturally from individuation. You understand that those who truly respect you will honor your limits without requiring a dissertation on your reasoning. Those who consistently challenge your boundaries are revealing their own lack of respect for your autonomy and their investment in keeping you accessible for their convenience rather than honoring your growth.
Jung understood that the psyche possesses an inherent wisdom that knows when it's being invaded or violated, much like the immune system recognizes foreign substances in the body. When someone repeatedly tests your boundaries, your inner guidance system activates what we might call spiritual antibodies, creating an almost cellular-level rejection of their attempts to penetrate your sacred space. This response isn't learned. It's an organic development of consciousness, protecting itself from dissolution. The sixth thing that becomes impossible to tolerate is being used as a dumping ground for others' shadow projections. Jung's concept of shadow projection explains how people unconsciously attribute their own rejected qualities to others, then attack or manipulate those people as a way of avoiding their own darkness. When someone consistently sees in you the very qualities they refuse to acknowledge in themselves, a mature soul recognizes this dynamic immediately. Perhaps they accuse you of being selfish when you establish boundaries, projecting their own unacknowledged selfishness onto your healthy self-care. Maybe they call you cold when you refuse to engage in their emotional drama, unable to see their own emotional manipulation. These projections feel foreign because they don't match your inner experience of yourself, creating a dissonance that your awakened consciousness cannot ignore. The ability to return projections without absorbing them becomes a crucial skill in spiritual maturity. You learn to say, essentially, "This belongs to you, not me," without necessarily speaking these words aloud. Sometimes this happens through simple refusal to accept the projection, other times through creating space until the person deals with their own psychological material rather than trying to process it through you. The seventh intolerable thing is being expected to participate in repetitive emotional dramas. Jung understood that unconscious people often get trapped in what he called complexes, autonomous psychological patterns that play out the same themes repeatedly. When you've done your inner work, you can observe these patterns in others without feeling compelled to step into the drama as either rescuer, persecutor, or victim. This might look like the friend who creates the same crisis every few months, always with slight variations but fundamentally the same theme. They might cycle through relationships, jobs, or conflicts with the same underlying dynamics, expecting you to provide the same emotional support for essentially the same unconscious pattern. A mature soul recognizes these cycles and refuses to energize them with their participation. The wisdom to observe without engaging becomes a form of compassion, both for yourself and the other person. By refusing to enable these repetitive patterns, you create space for genuine growth to occur. Your withdrawal of energy from the drama often forces the person to face their patterns more directly, though they may initially experience your boundaries as abandonment or betrayal. The eighth thing that becomes unbearable is chronic falseness and superficiality. Jung wrote extensively about the dangers of living entirely through persona, the social mask, without connection to authentic inner life. When you've established a relationship with your true self, encountering people who live perpetually behind masks feels physically uncomfortable, like trying to have a conversation with a hologram. These interactions often involve what Jung might call persona-to-persona communication, where neither person is actually present in the exchange. The conversation remains on the surface of social pleasantries, career achievements, or gossip about others, never touching the realm of authentic human experience. For someone who has tasted the richness of genuine connection, these exchanges begin to feel like spiritual starvation. The inability to participate in false social performances isn't snobbishness, but sensitivity. Your system has become attuned to authenticity and rejects what feels artificial. This doesn't mean you become harsh or judgmental toward those still living primarily through persona. It simply means you cannot pretend these interactions nourish your soul when they clearly don't. Consider how a master craftsman can no longer find satisfaction in shoddy workmanship, not from arrogance, but from genuine appreciation for quality and beauty. Similarly, once your psyche has experienced the nourishment of authentic connection, superficial interactions feel like trying to sustain yourself on empty calories. Jung called this the development of discriminating consciousness, where the soul learns to distinguish between what feeds its growth and what merely occupies its time. The ninth unbearable thing is mediocrity as a standard of living. Jung's concept of individuation includes what he called the transcendent function, which constantly pushes consciousness toward greater integration and expression of potential. When this function is active, settling for less than your authentic capacity becomes spiritually impossible. This isn't perfectionism born from ego, but excellence as natural expression of an awakened soul. This might manifest as inability to remain in jobs that don't honor your gifts, relationships that don't allow for mutual growth, or social environments that discourage depth and authenticity. The comfort of familiar mediocrity becomes less appealing than the challenge of unknown expansion. Your soul begins to feel claustrophobic in situations that once felt safe, simply because they were predictable. The refusal to accept mediocrity isn't about becoming difficult or demanding. It's about honoring what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness that seeks full expression through your unique life. When you align with this deeper aspect of your psyche, choices that diminish or waste your potential become literally unthinkable because they violate your essential nature. The 10th and final thing that becomes impossible is betraying your own evolution. Perhaps this is the most profound shift of all. Jung understood that once consciousness expands to include new levels of awareness, it cannot authentically contract back to earlier stages. The knowledge you've gained about yourself, others, and the nature of reality becomes part of your permanent psychological structure. Pretending ignorance of what you now understand feels like a form of self-violence. This might mean you can no longer participate in family dynamics that require you to play the role you occupied before your awakening. You cannot pretend that shallow achievements still satisfy you when you've tasted deeper fulfillment. You cannot unknow the patterns you've recognized in yourself and others, cannot unfeel the expansion of your heart, cannot unsee the interconnectedness that individuation has revealed. The integrity that emerges from this process isn't rigid, but fluid, like water that naturally follows its course downhill. It's not that you judge your earlier self or others who haven't undergone similar development. It's simply that betraying your growth feels impossible, because it would require fragmenting your psyche, splitting yourself between who you were and who you've become. This leads us to a profound realization about spiritual maturity that Jung intuited but perhaps never fully articulated. The things we cannot tolerate aren't signs of spiritual pride or judgment. They're indicators that we've finally learned to respect ourselves enough to protect what is sacred within us. The boundaries aren't walls against the world, but containers for continued growth. There's a sacred mathematics to this process that Jung recognized in his study of synchronicity and meaningful coincidences. When we align with our authentic nature and refuse to compromise our spiritual integrity, we begin to attract experiences and relationships that match our inner frequency. The universe seems to conspire to bring us encounters that support rather than drain our development, as if our commitment to authenticity activates some cosmic principle of resonance that draws similar energy toward us. When we stop tolerating energetic violation, we create space for genuine intimacy. When we refuse manipulative theater, we make room for authentic vulnerability. When we honor our true nature instead of sacrificing it for approval, we give others permission to do the same. Each boundary we establish in service of our spiritual integrity becomes an invitation for others to meet us at a deeper level. The silence that emerges from this process isn't empty but full, pregnant with presence rather than explanation. You find yourself needing to justify less and less, because your life itself becomes the teaching. Your refusal to participate in unconscious patterns creates ripples that extend far beyond your immediate circle, modeling a different way of being human that honors both individual authenticity and collective healing. Jung believed that the individuated person serves not only their own development, but the evolution of human consciousness itself. Every time we refuse to betray our growth, We strengthen the morphic field of possibility for others.
Every boundary we establish from love rather than fear creates space for more authentic relating. Every time we choose presence over performance, we contribute to the healing of our collective human story. This isn't about becoming perfect or spiritual superior to others. It's about becoming so thoroughly yourself that pretense becomes impossible. It's about developing such deep respect for your own journey that you naturally protect what has been earned through genuine inner work.
It's about recognizing that true service to others comes not from endless accommodation, but from fierce commitment to your own authentic expression. The path of individuation ultimately leads to what Jung called the realization of the self, that archetypal center that connects us both to our unique individual essence and to the universal patterns that move through all human experience. From this center, tolerance and intolerance aren't opposites, but aspects of the same discriminating wisdom that knows what serves life and what diminishes it. As we conclude this exploration of spiritual maturity and sacred boundaries, remember that this isn't about becoming harsh or judgmental toward those who haven't done their inner work. It's about developing such clarity about your own nature that you naturally gravitate toward what nourishes your continued growth and step away from what stunts it. It's about trusting the wisdom that emerges when you've learned to distinguish between your ego's preferences and your soul's requirements. The invitation here isn't to create more separation, but to develop the kind of authentic presence that actually makes deeper connection possible. When you stop tolerating what violates your essence, you create space for what honors it. When you refuse to participate in unconscious patterns, you make room for conscious relating. When you protect your spiritual development with the same care you would protect a precious child, you give that development room to flourish and serve not only your own life, but the healing of our world. If this exploration has resonated with something deep within your own journey of awakening, I invite you to subscribe and share your own experiences in the comments below. What patterns have you found yourself unable to tolerate as you've grown spiritually? What boundaries have emerged naturally from your own process of individuation? Your insights contribute to our collective understanding of what it means to mature spiritually while remaining compassionately human. The conversation continues, and your voice matters in this ancient dialogue between individual authenticity and collective healing.